US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has wrapped up her Asia tour following stops in Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and finally Japan. The most controversial was her stopover in Taiwan, pushing cross-strait tensions to new heights and further straining US-China relations. Japan is a staunch US ally, but it's kept quiet about Ms Pelosi's controversial trip. Ms Kishida has more on Japan's reaction and Ms Pelosi's position on her Taiwan visit.
Nancy Pelosi wrapped up her Asian tour in Tokyo. She sat down for an hour-long breakfast with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, which started in a friendly mood. It was soon overshadowed by the cross-strait tensions following her visit to Taiwan. China on Thursday fired ballistic missiles into Japan's exclusive economic zone for the first time. This has alarmed the Japanese government. Mr. Kishida said Tokyo issued a complaint to Beijing, condemned the action, and to stop firing missiles immediately.
中国の弾道ミサイルが EEZ を含む我が国近海に落下したことは我が国の安全保障及び国民の安全に関わる重大な問題であり、中国に対し強く非難し抗議をしたということ。そして今般の中国側の行動は地域及び国際社会の平和と安定に深刻な影響を与えるものであり、軍事訓練の即刻中止を求めたこうした旨述べさせてもらいました。
Chinese large-scale drill around Taiwan was clearly in response to Mrs. Pelosi's Taiwan visit. Mr. Kishida did not react to her Taiwan visit out loud. Japan occupied Taiwan, and has since its normalization of ties with Beijing 50 years ago, it has supported the One China policy. Incumbent prime ministers and cabinet ministers have refrained from visiting Taiwan. It's no secret Japan has close economic and business ties with Taiwan. Some analysts in Japan feel Mrs. Pelosi has impacted ties between Japan and China as foreign ministerial talks between the two Asian giants were canceled following her visit to Taiwan. Earlier, China summoned the Japanese ambassador to Beijing to lodge stern representations over its participation in the G7 nations statement on Taiwan. But Mrs. Pelosi tried to justify her visit to Taiwan in a news conference she had in Tokyo to wrap up her Asian tour.
The Chinese have tried to isolate Taiwan, keeping them most recently from the World Health Organization by not even letting their participation be on the agenda of the World Health Agency, whatever that makes these determinations. They may try to keep Taiwan from visiting or participating in other places, but they will not isolate Taiwan by preventing us to travel there.
With Mr. Kishida, Mrs. Pelosi also exchanged views on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea in achieving a world without nuclear weapons ahead of Hiroshima Peace Memorial this Saturday. She also met her Japanese counterpart and other high-ranking Japanese officials. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
And Tokyo also says 2 Chinese military drones flew between islands in southwestern Japan when China started its drills yesterday. Japan's Air Self-Defense Force scrambled fighter aircraft in response, but the drones did not enter Japan's airspace. For more on this, we're joined by Ben Bland, Director of the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House. He joins us live from London. Mr. Bland, news out in the last few hours, China upping the ante. It has cancelled defense meetings, suspending key climate talks on top of sanctioning Nancy Pelosi and her family. Now, if this is China giving the strongest warning, telling someone hands off what for China is likely the most core of its core interest, that's Taiwan, do these moves, including the drills, measure up?
I think the response from Beijing has largely been in line with what the US government and what most analysts would have expected. So while particularly the live fire exercises are escalatory, I think they're disproportionate and they're very concerning. They're not beyond the bounds of what everyone, including the Taiwanese government, the US government, militaries of those countries would have expected. And I think the latest news about the Chinese government cancelling talks with the US on military questions and climate change just goes to show us that in this broader geopolitical competition between the US and China, there aren't many safe zones. People often talk about climate change as being one of the few areas where both sides could cooperate. But when there are so many tensions across so many different issues, it's really, really hard to isolate certain topics where you can get along while you have this broad spectrum competition, particularly when it's so tense around a question like Taiwan.
And very quickly, because we would not know things like these, are these very severe moves? Can you, for example, restart talks on security and climate change very quickly once relations improve?
Well, some of these talks have been suspended, some have been cancelled, but for sure, I think there's definitely a degree of flexibility in Beijing when it comes to the US relationship and vice versa. So if relations can improve, if tensions die down, and this is a sort of passing crisis over Taiwan, then for sure that can all be restarted. But I think when we see the direction of travel of the relationship between Beijing and Washington, obviously it gets harder and harder as the years go by and the tensions increase to find common ground. But certainly there's plenty of room for either side to sort of walk back or find ways to restart some of these talks, none of which are probably on vital issues. And ultimately, as two superpowers, if they want to talk about things, there are still ways they can do it. But I think that conversation gets harder and harder as tensions increase on so many different issues, not just Taiwan, but things like the South China Sea, competition over technology, and many other questions.
Well, the sounds coming out of Beijing and Washington right now not conducive to any kind of conversation. Now, the responses from other countries, so individual countries, blocs, the G7, the EU and ASEAN as example, do you think anyone is saying anything that could lead to any kind of breakthrough and stop this rather heated rhetoric that is built, each side saying the same thing, just beefing it up?
I think it's really hard to see, when you have China and the US clashing over Taiwan, it's hard to see many other countries wanting to get in the middle. I think it was interesting to see Japan, which hasn't really supported Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And I think there were definitely some concerns in the Japanese government about that being potentially seen as a provocative move. But the move having happened, the visit having happened, they're now publicly speaking out against China's response as disproportionate and concerning to regional security. That's probably the strongest response in the region. I think the Australians have also raised quite a lot of concerns about the live-fire exercises. I think for Southeast Asian countries, they all have slightly different relationships with China and slightly different relationships with Taiwan too. But I think broadly, they're quite wary of being stuck in the middle. So there's grave concern that the potential for this to spin out of control, for accidents to happen or miscalculations. And in fact, just the fact that we have heightened tensions could damage economic prospects for the region, given that Taiwan sits in the middle of many of the key global trade routes for shipping, for aviation as well. And there are many Southeast Asian people, of course, living in Taiwan too. So there's a concern that this could have knock-on effects on the regional economic prospects at a time when Southeast Asia is only just coming out of the pandemic, when across the world we're really concerned about cost of living and economic growth too.
And final question here. Well, it must count for something that China's foreign minister, in the midst of all this, still did attend the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting, although he did not. He cancelled one-to-ones with certain ministers, such as, for example, his counterpart from Japan. But you've got within ASEAN countries, an example, Singapore, a strong security partner with the US, but maintaining relatively cordial relations still with China. Countries like these, or Thailand, Laos, Malaysia as an example, would they be able to some way bridge the gap, the widening gap between these two superpowers?
I think it's going to be really difficult. I think it's hard enough for ASEAN as an organization managing domestic challenges, managing the problems we've seen in Myanmar, the escalating conflict since the coup last year. So managing those problems is hard enough without thinking about dealing with problems outside Southeast Asia, outside of ASEAN's direct remit. So while we do see kind of a lot of general talk about ASEAN wanting to be central to the region, and obviously it does provide some forums for other powers to discuss these really difficult questions, which is good. At the same time, I don't think either the organization or the member states want to wade into this. And I think we can see it from the fact that the statement that came out of ASEAN about the crisis in Taiwan was actually separate from the main foreign ministers' communique out of the recent summit. So there's a desire to try and keep this away from ASEAN's ongoing work because it is such a third rail issue. There's so many sensitivities there. And I think most Southeast Asian countries want to try and keep their heads down rather than wade in.
Oh, thanks so much for all that, Ben Blen, Director of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House.